Rain has a way of telling the truth when people don't. If you've ever loved someone you never truly let go of. If you've ever typed a message and deleted it before sending. This story is for you. Stay with me until the end, because some love stories don't begin with a meeting, they begin with a message that arrives far too late. If this story moves you, like, subscribe, and share it with someone who still lives between the words they never said. The rain had been falling since before Ethan Walker woke up. Not the dramatic kind, the kind that announced itself with thunder or demanded attention. But the quiet Seattle rain. The kind that lingered. The kind that soaked into sidewalks and jackets and thoughts until you stopped noticing where it ended and you began. Ethan stood by the window of his apartment, coffee cooling in his hand, watching the city blur into streaks of gray and silver. Cars moved below like ghosts. Umbrellas bloomed and folded. The world carried on, indifferent to the fact that something inside him had been stalled for years. This was his favorite hour of the day. Early morning. Before emails. Before meetings. Before people expected him to be present. In this small pocket of time, he could exist without explanation. He leaned his forehead lightly against the glass. It was cold. Grounding. Seattle suited him that way. People said the rain made the city depressing. Ethan had always thought the opposite. The rain gave him permission to feel things quietly. To be introspective without being questioned. To keep his emotions folded neatly inside, where they wouldn't trouble anyone. That was how he lived now. Contained, functional, carefully balanced. His phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Once, he ignored it. Another buzz followed a moment later. Then another. Ethan exhaled slowly. Annoyance flickering across his calm. Work, probably. Someone in a different time zone who didn't understand mornings were sacred. He picked up the phone without looking, thumb already poised to silence it. And then he saw the name. Claire Bennett. For a long second, the room seemed to tilt. The rain outside grew louder, or maybe that was just his pulse in his ears. His grip tightened around the phone, as if it might slip away, as if the name itself were something unstable. Claire. The name he hadn't said out loud in years. The name he'd trained himself to think of only in fragments. Memories dulled at the edges. Carefully packed away so they wouldn't cut him open when he wasn't prepared. His thumb hovered above the screen. Message preview. Hi Ethan. I don't know if this number still works. I wasn't sure if I should send this. But I kept thinking about the rain in Seattle today. That was all. No explanation. No accusation. No past dragged into the present. Just rain. Ethan sat down heavily in the chair by the window. His coffee tipped slightly, a dark ripple sloshing against the rim, but he didn't notice. His attention had narrowed to the soft glow of the screen, and the way his chest felt suddenly too tight. He hadn't heard from Claire in over 3 years. Not a text. Not an email. Not a social media like or accidental notification. She had vanished from his life with the kind of clean precision that only comes after deep hurt. And he had let her. He closed his eyes. The past didn't rush back all at once. It never did. It came in pieces, sensations first. The warmth of her hand. The cadence of her voice when she was thinking out loud. The way she used to pause before speaking, as if choosing honesty carefully. Ethan opened his eyes again and stared at the message. He read it once. Then again. Each time, the words seemed to rearrange themselves, as if testing him. As if asking whether he was ready now. Whether he would finally respond instead of retreat. His phone buzzed again, But this time it wasn't a new message. Just the subtle vibration of the rain alert app updating the forecast. Rain all day. Of course. Ethan let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, though there was no humor in it. He had spent years convincing himself that silence was kinder. That distance was safer. That if he stepped away quietly enough, the damage would be minimal. He had told himself Claire would move on. That she deserved someone unafraid of choosing her fully. That love wasn't enough if timing and courage didn't align. All of that had sounded very reasonable in the aftermath. It sounded thinner now. He stood and began pacing the apartment, phone still in his hand. The place was minimalist, intentional, clean lines, neutral colors. A life designed for efficiency, not intimacy. Nothing here bore the imprint of another person. No shared mugs. No extra toothbrush. No photographs that suggested history beyond his own. He had built it that way on purpose. Claire's message sat unread now, though he knew it by heart already. He walked to the kitchen, set the coffee down untouched, then leaned against the counter. His reflection stared back at him in the darkened window, older than he remembered feeling. Lines of quiet exhaustion etched around his eyes. "What are you doing?" he murmured to no one. Responding meant opening a door he had sealed with careful finality. Not responding meant continuing a pattern he was no longer sure he believed in. He thought of the last time he'd seen her. Not the conversation. That came later. But the moment before it. The way she had been standing slightly turned away, arms crossed not defensively, but protectively. As if she already knew something was slipping beyond her control. Back then, he had thought restraint was strength. Now, staring at her name glowing on his phone, he wondered how much of that restraint had really been fear. He scrolled up, half, expecting to see years of unsent messages beneath her text, ghosts of words that had never crossed the distance between them. Instead, there was only this moment. Clean, undemanding. "I kept thinking about the rain in Seattle today." It was such a Claire thing to say. She had always noticed weather, small details, the emotional undercurrents people overlooked. She had loved Seattle for him, even when she lived somewhere else. Even when it made no practical sense. Ethan sank back into the chair. He imagined her wherever she was now. Boston, if memory served. Different streets. Different sky. Maybe different life. Had she hesitated before pressing send? Had she debated, deleted, rewritten? Or had this message slipped out in a moment of weakness, carried on the same rain that tapped insistently against his window? His phone felt heavier with every passing second. 3 years ago, he had chosen silence because he believed it would hurt less than honesty. Today, silence felt like a decision he might not survive repeating. Ethan typed one word. "Hi." He stared at it, deleted it, typed again. "Claire." Deleted. He exhaled sharply and set the phone face down on the table, as if removing it from sight could steady his thoughts. The rain outside showed no signs of stopping. Drops raced each other down the glass, some colliding, some breaking apart, all eventually disappearing into nothing. Between raindrops, he thought. That was where everything important seemed to happen. In the pauses. In the unsaid spaces. In the moments people convinced themselves didn't count. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was another message. "You don't have to reply. I just wanted you to know I remembered." Ethan closed his eyes. Something inside him shifted. Not dramatically, not explosively, but enough to change the balance of everything that followed. For the first time in years, he didn't feel protected by the distance he'd created. He felt exposed. And strangely, undeniably alive. The rain kept falling. And somewhere between the sound of it against the window and the weight of the phone in his hand, Ethan Walker realized that this wasn't the start of something new. It was the continuation of something he'd never truly finished. The memory came back to Ethan the way it always did. Without warning, without mercy. It began, as most important things in his life had, with rain. Seattle had been soaked that week, the city wrapped in a gray stillness that felt heavier than usual. The clouds sat low, pressing down on rooftops and shoulders alike, and Ethan remembered thinking that the weather matched the feeling in his chest far too well. Claire had been standing by the window then too, just like he had been that morning years later. Only back then, it wasn't his apartment. It was theirs. If not in name, then a small space with mismatched furniture, half-packed boxes, and the quiet tension of something unspoken growing larger by the hour. She hadn't turned around when he entered the room. That detail always stayed with him. Claire wasn't avoiding him. She was bracing herself. Ethan remembered setting his bag down more carefully than necessary, as if silence itself were fragile and might shatter if he moved too abruptly. The rain traced slow paths down the glass, mirroring the way his thoughts refused to move in straight lines. "We need to talk," he had said. The words sounded rehearsed even to his own ears. Claire's shoulders rose slightly with her breath, then settled. She nodded once, still facing the window. "Okay," she replied. Just one word. Calm, controlled. That calm had unnerved him more than anger ever could have. He had spent days, weeks, if he were honest, preparing for that conversation. He had framed it as responsibility, as practicality, as something adults did when love alone wasn't enough to bridge the widening gap between careers, cities, and expectations. At least, that's what he told himself. In truth, there was another feeling beneath it all. One he hadn't known how to name at the time. Fear. Ethan had been offered the Houston role unexpectedly. A fast-track position, bigger responsibility, a clear signal that his career was accelerating in ways he'd always planned for but never quite believed would arrive so soon. Houston wasn't Seattle. It wasn't rain and reflection and quiet pauses. It was heat and movement and forward momentum. It was opportunity. It was also a distance he wasn't sure he knew how to navigate with Claire, with them. She had listened as he explained it, turning away from the window, at last to face him fully. Her expression had been open, attentive, unreadable. "I could come with you," she said when he finished. Just like that. No hesitation. No conditions. The simplicity of her answer had shaken him more than any argument would have. They stood there, facing each other, rain filling the space between their words. Ethan remembered noticing how tired she looked then. Not exhausted. Just worn in a way that came from caring deeply and carrying it quietly. "I know," he had said. "But I don't think that's fair to you." Claire tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Fair? You've built something here," he continued, choosing his words with care. "Your work, your life. I don't want you to feel like you're uprooting everything just because of me." There it was. The logic. The reasonableness. The shield. Claire crossed her arms, not defensively, but protectively, as if gathering herself inward. "Ethan," she said gently, "I wouldn't be doing it just because of you. I'd be doing it with you." That distinction mattered. He knew it did. He just didn't know how to accept it. The truth. one he hadn't been able to articulate then, was that he was terrified of becoming the kind of man who asked someone to sacrifice without being absolutely certain he could give them everything in return. He wasn't certain of anything back then. Not the job, not the future, not even himself. What he had been certain of was that leaving first felt safer than staying and failing later. "I don't want you to resent me," he said finally. Claire's eyes flickered at that. Something passed through them. Hurt, perhaps, or disbelief. "You don't get to decide that for me," she replied. Her voice remained calm, but the steadiness had sharpened. That was the moment the conversation shifted. Not outwardly, but internally, something fragile cracked. Ethan remembered looking at her and realizing that every word he spoke from that point forward would either build a bridge or burn one, and he chose distance. I think we need to take a step back," he said. The sentence landed between them, heavy and irrevocable. Claire stared at him, searching his face for something he wasn't offering. "A step back from what?" "From us," he answered quietly. The rain seemed to pause, as if even it were listening. She inhaled slowly, then exhaled just as deliberately. "Is this about Houston?" "It's about everything," he replied. That wasn't entirely untrue. It just wasn't complete. Claire nodded once, absorbing the words. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't plead. Instead, she did something far more devastating. She accepted it. "Okay," she said again. The same word. The same calm. Ethan had expected questions. Resistance. Anything that would make the decision feel harder, heavier, more real. Her composure robbed him of that. They spoke for another hour after that, though neither of them ever remembered exactly what was said. Logistics. Timing. Vague assurances about staying in touch. Promises made in good faith, but without conviction. When he left that night, the rain had intensified, soaking through his jacket before he reached the car. He hadn't turned back. He hadn't looked up at the window to see if she was watching. He told himself that restraint was kindness. Houston was everything Seattle wasn't. Heat pressed down on him from the moment he stepped off the plane. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if movement itself required more effort. The city buzzed with life. Cars, voices, ambition. Ethan threw himself into the work with a focus that bordered on obsession. Long hours, early mornings, late nights. He told himself that productivity was progress. Claire texted him that first week. Just small things. Updates, observations, attempts at normalcy. He responded at first, carefully, politely, then less often, then not at all. Each unanswered message felt like a small betrayal, but also like a line being drawn more clearly. He convinced himself that clean breaks healed faster. What he didn't account for was the slow erosion that silence caused, not just to her, but to him. In Houston, alone in his temporary apartment, he would sometimes wake in the middle of the night convinced he'd heard rain against the window. There was none. Only the hum of the city and the weight of choices made too quietly to be undone. Years later, sitting in his Seattle apartment, with Claire's name glowing on his phone once more, Ethan felt the full shape of that moment for the first time. Not as justification, as consequence. He realized then that the day it ended hadn't been loud or dramatic or final in the way stories often portray. It had been quiet, measured, polite. And in that quiet, he had lost her. Not because he stopped loving her, but because he was too afraid to stay when love demanded courage instead of control. The rain continued to fall outside his window, steady and unrelenting. somewhere between Seattle and Houston, between then and now. Ethan finally understood that the hardest goodbyes weren't the ones filled with tears. They were the ones that sounded reasonable. Silence did not arrive all at once. It crept into Ethan Walker's life, the way dampness crept into Seattle winters. Slowly, subtly, until one day it was everywhere, and he could no longer remember what it felt like to be dry. In the beginning, the quiet felt intentional, purposeful, even virtuous. He told himself that distance was a form of respect, that giving Claire space was the final kindness he could offer after choosing to leave. He framed his restraint as maturity, as emotional intelligence, as proof that he wasn't clinging to something that had already reached its natural end. Those explanations worked best in the daylight. At night, they unraveled. Ethan's Seattle apartment had changed since those early days. The furniture was newer, more cohesive. The walls held framed prints, now instead of blank white space. There were plants that survived because he remembered to water them on schedule. From the outside, his life looked settled, upgraded, forward-moving. Inside, it felt like a room with all the doors closed. Mornings followed a predictable rhythm. Wake before the alarm. Coffee brewed strong and black. News headlines skimmed without absorption. The rain, always present in some form, became background noise rather than something he noticed. He walked to work when the weather allowed. The streets smelled like wet pavement and evergreen trees, a combination he had once loved because it made everything feel clean and honest. Now it just felt familiar. At the office, he was reliable, focused, efficient, the kind of person people trusted with responsibility because he didn't bring unnecessary emotion into professional spaces. He had learned how to compartmentalize well. Too well. Conversations stayed surface level. Colleagues talked about weekend plans, new restaurants, relationships unfolding in predictable arcs. Ethan listened, nodded, contributed when required. He never spoke about Claire. Not because he was hiding her, exactly, but because speaking her name felt like opening a window in a room he'd worked very hard to seal. On evenings when the rain was particularly relentless, he sometimes took longer routes home. Not out of indecision, but out of a vague hope that movement might stir something inside him. It rarely did. The silence he'd chosen years ago had grown comfortable. That was the most unsettling part. He had adapted to it, the way people adapted to low light, adjusting until they forgot there was ever more to see. Ethan dated occasionally. Nothing serious. Nothing messy. There were a few women over the years. Kind, intelligent, present. They laughed easily. Asked thoughtful questions. Suggested plans that implied continuity. He ended things before expectations could solidify. He told himself he was being honest. That he wasn't leading anyone on. That it was better to recognize incompatibility early rather than drag something out. What he didn't tell anyone, not even himself, not at first, was that the silence he carried into those relationships left no room for anything else to grow. Every connection felt muted, like listening to music through a wall. Sometimes, late at night, he would open his phone and scroll through old messages. Not Claire's. He deleted those during his first year back in Seattle, convinced that removing the evidence would make moving on easier. Instead, the absence had sharpened the outline of what remained. He would stare at blank screens, thumbs hovering, composing messages that never reached anyone, apologies with no recipient, explanations no one had asked for, confessions that felt too heavy to release into the world. He never sent them. Over time, Even the urge to type faded. Silence, when practiced long enough, became instinct. The rain outside his apartment window marked the passing of seasons. Summer arrived briefly, half-hearted and unsure. Fall followed, generous and golden, before dissolving back into gray. Ethan measured time less by dates and more by changes in the light. Years passed like that. He was promoted, respected, invited to things. And yet, on certain evenings, usually when the rain hit the glass just right, he felt the echo of a life he might have lived differently. Not dramatically, not disastrously, just warmer. The memory of Claire didn't intrude often. It lingered at the edges of his awareness, surfacing in small, unexpected ways. A book she would have liked in a shop window. A phrase someone used that mirrored her cadence. A pause in conversation where he instinctively waited for her voice to fill the space. Those moments never stayed long. He'd learned how to acknowledge them without engaging, like passing a familiar street, without turning down it. He believed this was what healing looked like. Contained, controlled, quiet, until the morning her message arrived. Now, standing in the same apartment that had borne witness to so much silence, Ethan felt something shift under his feet. Claire's words, simple, undemanding, had unsettled the balance he'd built his life upon. I kept thinking about the rain in Seattle today. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't an invitation. It was a recognition. She remembered. And in remembering, she had reached across years of quiet he'd assumed were mutual. Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, phone in his hand, rain threading down the window like a visual reminder that some things never truly stopped. He realized then that silence hadn't erased the past. It had only delayed its reckoning. He thought about the man he'd become since Houston, since Seattle, since Claire. Efficient, capable, unburdened by visible longing. And yet, faced with her message, those qualities felt suddenly insufficient. He wasn't sure what responding would change. He only knew that not responding would preserve a version of himself he was no longer certain he wanted to be. The rain continued its steady rhythm, indifferent to his hesitation. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't try to ignore it. He listened, and in that listening he acknowledged a truth he'd spent far too long avoiding. Silence had protected him, but it had also kept him alone. Claire Bennett learned how to make silence look like strength. In Palo Alto, silence was everywhere, threaded through glass offices, late-night cafes, and the spaces between conversations where ambition hummed louder than emotion. It lived in the pause before someone answered a question, in the polite nods exchanged after meetings ended, in the way people smiled without revealing anything they couldn't quantify. Claire adapted quickly. She told herself it was necessary. The move to Silicon Valley had been deliberate, strategic, a decision rooted in momentum rather than escape. At least, that was how she framed it when people asked. Boston had been an option. New York too. But Palo Alto carried a promise of reinvention that appealed to her at the time. Sunlight spilled generously here. Mornings arrived bright and decisive, unburdened by hesitation. The air smelled of eucalyptus and asphalt warmed by purpose. Everything felt forward-facing. Unlike Seattle. Unlike Houston. Unlike the memory she carried with her like a second pulse. Her apartment was small but efficient, tucked into a complex that buzzed with quiet productivity. Neighbors nodded politely, earbuds in, lives unfolding on parallel tracks that rarely intersected. Claire liked it that way. She filled her days with structure. Early runs beneath cloudless skies. Long hours at work, where focus was praised and vulnerability politely discouraged. Evenings spent reviewing notes, refining plans, investing her energy in things that offered measurable returns. At night, when the world finally slowed, the silence found her again. It was different here. Not heavy like Seattle's rain, soaked quiet. Not sharp like Houston's late night heat pressing against glass. This silence was clean, bright, efficient, and lonely. In the first weeks after Ethan left, she had tried to maintain normalcy, texting him updates about her day, sharing small observations the way she always had. Something she'd seen, a thought she couldn't quite shake. She kept her tone light, unassuming. She didn't want to sound needy. She didn't want to pressure him. When his replies grew shorter, she adjusted. When they grew less frequent, she rationalized. He's busy. He's adjusting. This is temporary. She believed each explanation, because believing felt easier than confronting the alternative. Eventually, the messages stopped altogether. Claire remembered the day she realized she was alone in the conversation. She had sent a text about nothing in particular, just a comment about the weather, a habit she hadn't yet broken. Hours passed. Then a day. The silence that followed wasn't dramatic. There was no final argument, no definitive ending, just absence, expanding until it filled the space where connection used to live. She didn't send another message. Not out of pride. Out of self-preservation. In Palo Alto, she learned how to carry that decision with grace. At work, she excelled. Her focus sharpened. Her instincts refined. She earned respect not through force, but through consistency. People learned they could rely on her to deliver without theatrics. She became known as composed, steady, unflappable. No one knew how much effort that composure required at first. In the evenings, she sometimes walked through quiet neighborhoods lined with trees and soft porch lights. The air cooled gently after sunset, the heat of the day receding like a held breath finally released. She imagined what Ethan would say about the place. He would like the order of it. The sense of motion. The promise of progress. She wondered if he ever thought of her when the sun went down. The question stopped hurting after a while. Or rather, it hurt differently. Duller, more manageable. Like a bruise pressed often enough to lose its sharpness. Claire dated, too. She met people through friends, through work, through happenstance. Men who were confident, interesting, emotionally available in ways Ethan had never quite allowed himself to be. She tried. She really did. But every connection felt slightly misaligned, as if the timing was always off by just enough to matter. Conversations flowed easily, yet something essential never took root. She realized, eventually, that she wasn't waiting for Ethan to come back. She was waiting for herself to stop measuring everything against the version of love she'd lost. That realization came late one night, standing barefoot in her kitchen, a glass of water warming in her hand. She hadn't cried over Ethan in months. The tears surprised her when they arrived. Not because she missed him. Because she finally allowed herself to acknowledge what his silence had cost her. Trust didn't break all at once. It eroded slowly, invisibly, until one day she realized she had learned to expect absence instead of presence. She didn't want to live like that. So she changed. Not overnight. Not dramatically. She set boundaries. Chose herself more deliberately. Learned how to sit with discomfort, without immediately filling it. In Palo Alto, surrounded by people chasing the next breakthrough, Claire learned that survival wasn't the same as fulfillment. Years passed. She advanced. Saved money. built a life that looked inviolable from the outside. Inside, she grew quieter, but stronger. She moved to Boston eventually, seeking a different rhythm, a place where history layered itself openly over the present, where introspection felt less like an indulgence and more like a necessity. By the time she left California, she believed she had made peace with the past. Then came the rain. Not Palo Alto rain. Rare, fleeting. Seattle rain. She had been standing at a cafe window in Boston when it happened, watching droplets blur the street outside. Something about the sound, the persistence, the softness, reached into her without warning. Seattle. Ethan. The memory surfaced fully formed, not painful, not gentle, just real. She didn't plan the message. She didn't rehearse it. Her fingers moved before her doubts could intervene. Hi, Ethan. I don't know if this number still works. She paused there, heart steady, breath controlled. She wasn't asking for anything. She just wanted to acknowledge what had been. I kept thinking about the rain in Seattle today. When she pressed send, she felt something loosen inside her. Not hope, not expectation, just honesty. Whatever came next, or didn't, would no longer be shaped by silence alone. And for the first time since Houston, Claire Bennett allowed herself to believe that reaching out wasn't weakness. It was courage, finally practiced without fear. Boston arrived in Claire Bennett's life quietly, not with the ambition of Palo Alto or the emotional weight of Seattle, but with a steadiness that felt earned rather than promised. The city did not rush her. It did not demand reinvention. It simply existed, brick and history and weather that changed its mind without apology. Claire liked that. She moved into a narrow apartment on a tree-lined street where the buildings leaned toward one another like old friends. The floors creaked when she walked across them, and the windows rattled faintly when the wind came in from the river. Nothing about the place felt temporary. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to settle, without an exit plan. Her mornings began slowly. Coffee brewed while sunlight filtered through half-open blinds, catching dust in the air like suspended time. Outside, footsteps echoed against pavement worn smooth by generations before her. Boston carried its past openly, unapologetically layered into the present. Claire found comfort in that honesty. She walked to the cafe at the corner most mornings, the same one where she'd been standing when the rain had triggered a memory she hadn't realized was still waiting. The barista knew her order now. There was no performance required, no explanation. Just routine. Routine, she learned, could be grounding. At work, she occupied a space that suited her. Challenging without being relentless, collaborative without being invasive. Her colleagues respected her boundaries. They trusted her instincts. No one asked her to be louder than she was. In Boston, Claire didn't have to prove her worth through constant motion. That was new. Evenings stretched differently here, longer, quieter. She spent them walking along the river, listening to water lap gently against stone, or sitting in her apartment with a book she sometimes forgot to read. Her thoughts wandered more often now. Not backward. She was careful about that, but inward. She thought about the person she had been when she left Seattle. The way she had measured her value through patience, through accommodation, through how much she was willing to endure quietly. She thought about Houston. The heat, the finality of that conversation disguised as reason. How she had accepted his decision with composure, because she didn't know how else to survive it. She hadn't been weak then. But she had been afraid. Afraid that if she fought, she would lose not only Ethan, but her dignity, afraid that insisting on clarity would expose how deeply his silence had already begun to wound her. Boston gave her space to acknowledge that truth without judgment. Here, she wasn't defined by what she had lost. She was defined by what she carried forward. Still, some nights, the past surfaced without invitation. She would be brushing her teeth, or folding laundry, or watching rain streak down the window. And suddenly she would remember the exact way Ethan's voice softened when he was about to say something difficult. The memory no longer shattered her, but it lingered. Claire had learned that healing wasn't about erasing those moments. It was about learning how to hold them without letting them dictate her present. She dated again in Boston. This time, she chose differently. She didn't chase potential. She didn't interpret emotional distance as mystery. She didn't excuse inconsistency as complexity. There was a man she saw for a few months. Kind, attentive, genuinely interested. They went to museums, shared dinners that stretched into thoughtful conversation. He asked her questions and listened to the answers. When she realized she didn't feel the urge to reach for him in moments of quiet, she ended it gently. Not because he lacked anything, because she had learned to trust the absence of longing as information, not failure. Claire's life, viewed from the outside, appeared settled, balanced, complete. And yet, on the morning she sent that message to Ethan, something inside her shifted. Not backward, but open. Standing in the cafe, rain blurring the street beyond the glass, she hadn't felt desperation. She had felt clarity. The memory that surfaced wasn't painful. It was precise. Seattle rain. A shared silence. A love that had never been given the chance to speak fully. She hadn't reached out to reopen a wound. She had reached out to close one. Now, days later, she sat at her kitchen table in Boston, phone resting face up beside her untouched coffee. The message had been sent. The vulnerability offered. Whatever came next was no longer in her control. She expected nothing. That was the difference. The waiting felt different too. Not anxious. Not hollow. Just present. Claire watched as rain began again outside, light at first, then steady. The city darkened slightly, the sky lowering itself into a familiar gray. Boston rain didn't feel like Seattle's. It didn't carry the same weight. But it still asked for reflection. She picked up her phone once, glanced at the screen, then set it back down. For years, silence had been imposed on her. This time, she had chosen to speak, and whether or not Ethan responded, Claire Bennett knew something fundamental had already changed. She was no longer living between unsent messages. She had finally allowed herself to send one. Boston arrived in Claire Bennett's life, quietly. Not with the ambition of Palo Alto or the emotional weight of Seattle, but with a steadiness that felt earned rather than promised. The city did not rush her. It did not demand reinvention. It simply existed. Brick and history and weather that changed its mind without apology. Claire liked that. She moved into a narrow apartment on a tree-lined street where the buildings leaned toward one another like old friends. The floors creaked when she walked across them, and the windows rattled faintly when the wind came in from the river. Nothing about the place felt temporary. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to settle without an exit plan. Her mornings began slowly. Coffee brewed while sunlight filtered through half-open blinds, catching dust in the air like suspended time. Outside, footsteps echoed against pavement worn smooth by generations before her. Boston carried its past openly, unapologetically layered into the present. Claire found comfort in that honesty. She walked to the cafe at the corner most mornings, the same one where she'd been standing when the rain had triggered a memory she hadn't realized was still waiting. The barista knew her order now. There was no performance required, no explanation. Just routine. Routine, she learned, could be grounding. At work, she occupied a space that suited her. Challenging without being relentless, collaborative without being invasive. Her colleagues respected her boundaries. They trusted her instincts. No one asked her to be louder than she was. In Boston, Claire didn't have to prove her worth through constant motion. That was new. Evenings stretched differently here. Longer. Quieter. She spent them walking along the river, listening to water lap gently against stone, or sitting in her apartment with a book she sometimes forgot to read. Her thoughts wandered more often now. Not backward. She was careful about that. But inward. She thought about the person she had been when she left Seattle. The way she had measured her value through patience, through accommodation, through how much she was willing to endure quietly. She thought about Houston. The heat, the finality of that conversation disguised as reason. How she had accepted his decision with composure, because she didn't know how else to survive it. She hadn't been weak then. But she had been afraid. Afraid that if she fought, she would lose not only Ethan, but her dignity. Afraid that insisting on clarity would expose how deeply his silence had already begun to wound her. Boston gave her space to acknowledge that truth without judgment. Here, she wasn't defined by what she had lost. She was defined by what she carried forward. Still, some nights, the past surfaced without invitation. She would be brushing her teeth, or folding laundry, or watching rain streak down the window, and suddenly, she would remember the exact way Ethan's voice softened when he was about to say something difficult. The memory no longer shattered her. But it lingered. Claire had learned that healing wasn't about erasing those moments. It was about learning how to hold them without letting them dictate her present. She dated again in Boston. This time, she chose differently. She didn't chase potential. She didn't interpret emotional distance as mystery. She didn't excuse inconsistency as complexity. There was a man she saw for a few months. Kind, attentive, genuinely interested. They went to museums, shared dinners that stretched into thoughtful conversation. He asked her questions and listened to the answers. When she realized she didn't feel the urge to reach for him in moments of quiet, she ended it gently. Not because he lacked anything, because she had learned to trust the absence of longing as information, not failure. Claire's life, viewed from the outside, appeared settled, balanced, complete. And yet, on the morning she sent that message to Ethan, something inside her shifted. Not backward, but open. Standing in the cafe, rain blurring the street beyond the glass, she hadn't felt desperation. She had felt clarity. The memory that surfaced wasn't painful. It was precise. Seattle rain. A shared silence. A love that had never been given the chance to speak fully. She hadn't reached out to reopen a wound. She had reached out to close one. Now, days later, she sat at her kitchen table in Boston, phone resting face up beside her untouched coffee. The message had been sent. The vulnerability offered. Whatever came next was no longer in her control. She expected nothing. That was the difference. The waiting felt different too. Not anxious, not hollow, just present. Claire watched as rain began again outside, light at first, then steady. The city darkened slightly, the sky lowering itself into a familiar gray. Boston rain didn't feel like Seattle's. It didn't carry the same weight. But it still asked for reflection. She picked up her phone once, glanced at the screen, then set it back down. For years, silence had been imposed on her. This time, she had chosen to speak. And whether or not Ethan responded, Claire Bennett knew something fundamental had already changed. She was no longer living between unsent messages. She had finally allowed herself to send one. The decision to meet did not arrive suddenly. It formed slowly, in the quiet spaces between messages, in the careful restraint of words, chosen not to rush ahead of intention. Ethan and Claire continued talking over the next few days, then weeks, their conversations unfolding with an almost reverent patience. They spoke about ordinary things at first. Work frustrations, weather patterns, books they were reading, shows they'd half watched while doing other things. The familiarity returned gradually, like a muscle memory neither of them had realized was still intact. They did not speak about Houston. They did not speak about endings. Not yet. Ethan noticed how the rhythm of his days began to change around those conversations. He woke earlier, not out of obligation, but anticipation. He checked his phone less obsessively, yet felt more present when it buzzed. The silence that had once filled his apartment no longer felt complete. In Seattle, the rain came and went in its usual unremarkable way, but Ethan found himself paying attention again. To the sound of it against the glass, to the way it softened the edges of the city, to how often Claire referenced it without meaning to, as if the weather itself had become a shared language. Boston mornings, she told him, were colder now. Sharper. Autumn announced itself there with confidence. I like that, she'd written once. It doesn't pretend to be anything else. He understood what she meant. They learned each other again carefully. Not as the people they used to be, but as the versions shaped by distance and time. Ethan noticed that Claire no longer softened her opinions to make space for agreement. She spoke clearly, decisively, without apology. He admired that more than he knew how to articulate. Claire noticed that Ethan asked better questions now. Slower ones. He listened in a way that suggested he wasn't preparing an exit, while the conversation was still unfolding. That mattered. The idea of meeting surfaced tentatively, almost accidentally. They were discussing travel, how work had pulled them into different cities over the years, how movement had become normal, expected. Ethan mentioned an upcoming conference in New York. Claire paused longer than usual before responding. I'll be there next month, she wrote. For a few days. The words lingered on his screen. Neither of them addressed it directly at first. They continued talking, as if circling a thought too fragile to touch outright. But once introduced, the possibility refused to disappear. It was Claire who finally named it. We could get coffee, she wrote one evening. If that doesn't feel strange. Ethan stared at the message longer than he had any other. Strange wasn't the word that came to mind. Terrifying felt closer. Necessary, closer still. I'd like that, he replied. If you would. The response came quickly. I would. After that, everything slowed. The days leading up to New York stretched differently, weighted by anticipation neither of them voiced explicitly. They didn't make elaborate plans. No reservations. No expectations beyond the simplicity of meeting. Just coffee. Just presence. Ethan found himself replaying memories he hadn't revisited in years. Not the painful ones, but the small, human details that had once made up the texture of loving Claire. The way she listened without interrupting. the way she noticed shifts in his tone before he was aware of them himself. He wondered how much of that would still be there. Claire, for her part, moved through her Boston routines with a quiet alertness. She noticed how often she imagined the sound of Ethan's voice, rather than the words he'd written, how her body remembered him in ways her mind had long disciplined itself not to dwell on. She reminded herself often this meeting was not a promise. It was a conversation given physical form. New York arrived with its usual lack of ceremony. Ethan flew in early, the city greeting him with noise and motion that felt jarring after Seattle's softened edges. Cars honked without apology. People moved with purpose, rarely looking up. The sky was overcast but dry. The air crisp. He checked into his hotel and stood at the window, watching the street below pulse with life. This city didn't wait. It demanded engagement. In his pocket, his phone buzzed. "I'm here," Claire wrote. "So am I," he replied. They chose a cafe near Midtown, neutral ground that belonged fully to neither of them. Somewhere bright, busy enough to absorb awkwardness if it arrived. Ethan arrived early. He sat at a small table near the window, hands wrapped around a coffee he hadn't tasted yet. Every few seconds, his attention flicked to the door. His reflection stared back at him in the glass. Composed, calm, betraying nothing of the internal reckoning unfolding beneath the surface. When Claire walked in, he recognized her immediately. Not because she looked exactly the same. She didn't, but because something unmistakable remained. A presence that occupied space without demanding it. A quiet confidence that felt both familiar and new. She wore a long coat, her hair pulled back loosely, a few strands escaping as if they'd refused to be managed. She paused just inside the door, scanning the room, and when her eyes found his, something passed between them that required no translation. Recognition. Claire smiled first. Not wide, not cautious. Just real. Ethan stood instinctively, the movement unplanned. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he replied. The word felt insufficient and perfect all at once. They didn't hug. Not immediately. They stood there for a fraction of a second too long, the space between them charged with years of absence and restraint. Then Claire stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him gently. Ethan returned the embrace carefully, aware of how much he was holding back. The contact was brief, respectful. But it landed deeper than he expected. When they pulled apart, both of them laughed softly, the sound releasing some of the tension they'd carried in. "This is strange," Claire said. "Yes," Ethan agreed. "But not bad." They sat. Conversation resumed with surprising ease, though the undercurrent remained undeniable. They spoke of neutral things at first. The city, the cafe, the absurdity of meeting like this after so much time. But beneath the words, awareness hummed. Ethan noticed how Claire's hands moved when she spoke, how she held eye contact without flinching. He noticed the faint lines at the corners of her eyes, earned rather than lost. Claire noticed how Ethan leaned in slightly when she spoke, as if unwilling to miss anything. How his posture had softened, how his attention didn't drift. They were careful not to rush into the past. But the past was there anyway, sitting quietly between them like a third presence. When their coffee cups sat empty, neither of them moved to leave. "I'm glad we did this," Claire said finally. "So am I," Ethan replied. It was the truest thing he'd said in years. Outside, the city continued its relentless pace. Inside the cafe, time seemed to pause just long enough for something fragile to take shape. They didn't make plans for what came next. They didn't need to. This meeting wasn't about resolution. It was about proof. That silence had not erased them, that distance had changed them but not hollowed them out completely. As they stood to leave, Claire hesitated. "This doesn't mean we have to figure everything out today," she said quietly. Ethan met her gaze, understanding the weight of what she was offering. "I know," he said. "I'm just grateful we're here." She nodded. So was she. They stepped back into the noise of New York together. Two people carrying shared history and cautious hope, moving forward without certainty, but no longer alone in the space between what had been lost and what might still be possible. The rain, far away in Seattle, continued to fall, and somewhere between cities, between past and present, something long paused had begun to move again. They walked without deciding where they were going. That, Ethan realized, felt significant. New York was not a city that invited aimlessness. It demanded intention, direction, momentum. And yet, there they were, moving side by side through the afternoon crowd, letting instinct choose their turns, allowing the city to flow around them rather than pulling them forward. The cafe disappeared behind them, replaced by the layered noise of traffic, voices, and footsteps echoing against concrete and glass. Claire tucked her hands into the pockets of her coat, shoulders relaxed but alert, as if she were listening for something beneath the surface of the city. Ethan matched her pace without thinking. It struck him how natural that felt. Not familiar in the way of habit, but familiar in the way of recognition, as if his body remembered how to exist beside her even after all this time. They spoke, but not about what mattered. Not yet. Conversation stayed safely adjacent to the truth, orbiting it without landing. They commented on the architecture, the contrast between old stone buildings and sharp modern lines. Claire mentioned a bookstore she loved nearby. Ethan pointed out a park he used to pass on previous trips. Safe terrain. Ethan noticed how carefully they were both doing this, choosing words that revealed personality without touching history. It wasn't avoidance born of indifference. It was avoidance born of respect. Neither of them wanted to shatter the fragile equilibrium they'd just created. At a crosswalk, they stopped, waiting for the light to change. The crowd pressed in around them. Strangers brushing past. Lives intersecting for seconds before diverging again. Claire glanced at him then. Not quickly. Not casually. She studied his face as if committing something to memory. "You look different," she said. Ethan exhaled a quiet laugh. "So do you." "That's not what I meant." He turned to face her more fully. "Then what did you mean?" She considered the question, eyes flicking briefly to the traffic, then back to him. "You look quieter, but not closed." The observation landed deeper than he expected. He nodded slowly. "I learned the difference. Eventually, the light changed. They crossed with the crowd, the moment passing but not dissolving. They continued walking. Claire spoke about Boston then. About the rhythm of it. The way the city seemed to hold space for reflection rather than constant reinvention. She talked about the river, the libraries, the way seasons announced themselves clearly there. "I didn't realize how much I needed that," she said. Clarity. Ethan listened, not interrupting, not offering solutions. Just absorbing. "That makes sense," he replied. "You always needed things to be honest, even when they were hard." She smiled faintly. "You remember that?" "Yes." Of course he did. They stopped at the edge of a small park, trees bare and branches etched against the sky. A bench sat unoccupied near the path, slightly damp from earlier rain. Claire hesitated. Ethan gestured toward it. "We can sit, if you want." She nodded, and they sat with a careful distance between them, not uncomfortable, but intentional. The city noise softened here, filtered through leaves and space. For a moment, neither spoke. This silence felt different from the ones that had come before. It wasn't imposed. It wasn't defensive. It was shared. Ethan broke it first. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me," he said quietly. Claire's gaze stayed forward. "I wasn't sure either." He waited. "But I knew I didn't want to keep wondering," she continued. "That felt worse than whatever awkwardness this might bring." He nodded. "I understand that now. I didn't back then." The words hovered between them. An acknowledgement without explanation. Claire turned toward him. One leg tucked beneath her, posture relaxed but eyes steady. "We don't have to talk about everything today," she said. "I just want to be clear about that." "I know," Ethan replied. "And I appreciate it." She studied him again, as if testing the sincerity behind the response. Apparently satisfied, she leaned back slightly, gaze lifting to the sky. "You were very good at sounding reasonable," she said softly. The sentence was neutral in tone, but not without weight. Ethan swallowed. "I thought I was being kind." "I know," she said. "That's what made it so hard to argue with." He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. "I didn't realize that kindness without honesty can still hurt." The Claire looked at him then, really looked at him. "That's not something people usually admit," she said. "I'm not trying to be impressive," he replied. "Just accurate." A faint smile touched her lips. They sat there, the city breathing around them, conversation drifting again into safer spaces. But now, the truth no longer felt as distant. It lingered close enough to be felt, even when unnamed. Ethan noticed how his body responded to her presence. Not with urgency, not with longing sharpened by fantasy, but with something steadier. A sense of alignment. As if being near her quieted a static he hadn't known was still running beneath his thoughts. Claire noticed it too, though she framed it differently. She noticed how she didn't feel the need to perform. How she didn't feel smaller beside him, or louder to compensate. She felt level. That surprised her. They talked about books they'd loved recently. About how tastes changed with time. About how some stories revealed different truths, depending on when you encountered them. "Maybe that's true of people too," Ethan said. "Maybe timing changes what we're able to hear." Claire considered that. Or what we're willing to say. The words hung there, deliberate. "Yes," he agreed. "That too." As afternoon edged toward evening, the light shifted, shadows stretching longer across the path. The air cooled, and Claire drew her coat a little tighter around herself. Ethan noticed, and shrugged out of his jacket instinctively, offering it without comment. She hesitated, then accepted. "Thank you," she said quietly. The gesture felt intimate in a way words hadn't yet been. Not because of physical closeness, but because of awareness. Because it was something he noticed without being asked. They walked again, slower now. Eventually, they reached a corner where their paths would diverge. Claire needed to return to her hotel. Ethan had commitments of his own. Neither seemed eager to name the separation. "This was," Claire began, then stopped. "Good," Ethan offered. She smiled. "Yes, it was." She hesitated again, then spoke with gentle firmness. "I want to be clear about something." He nodded, attentive. "I'm not here to reopen old wounds," she said. "And I'm not here to pretend nothing happened. I just needed to know whether the silence was the whole story." Ethan met her gaze, the weight of the moment settling fully now. "It wasn't," he said. "It was never the whole story." She studied him for a long moment, searching for evasion, for retreat. Finding none, she nodded. "That matters," she said. They stood there, the city moving relentlessly around them, a small pocket of stillness, carved out by shared restraint and growing honesty. "I don't know what comes next," Claire said. "Neither do I," Ethan replied. "But I'd like to keep talking. If you're open to that." She considered him carefully, then nodded once. "I am." They didn't hug this time. They didn't need to. Claire handed back his jacket, fingers brushing his briefly in the exchange. The contact was fleeting, but intentional. "I'll see you around," she said. "I hope so," he replied. As she walked away, Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer, watching until she disappeared into the crowd. The truth they had avoided all afternoon remained unspoken. But it no longer felt unreachable. It felt close enough to demand courage. And for the first time, Ethan wasn't afraid of what speaking it might cost. The evening settled over New York with a kind of reluctant grace. Lights flickered on one by one, windows glowing like scattered constellations as the city shifted from urgency to endurance. The air cooled, carrying with it the faint metallic scent of rain that hadn't yet arrived but felt inevitable all the same. Ethan walked more slowly now, his steps unanchored by destination. Claire had disappeared into the crowd minutes ago, but the imprint of her presence lingered with unsettling clarity. He replayed the conversation in fragments. Not the words themselves, but the spaces between them. Those spaces felt louder than anything they had said. He returned to his hotel room and stood just inside the door, bag still slung over his shoulder. The room was impersonal in the way all hotels were. Clean, neutral, temporary. It suited the version of him who had once believed everything important could be postponed. Tonight, it felt insufficient. Ethan set his bag down and loosened his tie, then sat on the edge of the bed without turning on the lights. The city outside pressed close to the window, its noise muted but persistent. Claire's voice echoed in his head. The silence wasn't the whole story. She had said it calmly, but the implication had landed like a quiet challenge. He closed his eyes and let the memory of Houston rise unbidden. Not the conversation itself. He had lived with that long enough. But the moment afterward. The way he had sat alone in his car, hands resting uselessly on the steering wheel, staring at nothing while convincing himself that pain was temporary and distance was manageable. He had never revisited that moment honestly. Until now. Across the city, Claire sat by her own hotel window, shoes kicked off, coat draped over a chair. The room smelled faintly of detergent and unfamiliar soap. She stared out at the lights without really seeing them. The meeting had gone better than she expected. That, somehow, made it harder. She had prepared herself for awkwardness, for emotional clumsiness, for the possibility that seeing Ethan again would reopen wounds she'd carefully scarred over. Instead, she felt unsettled in a quieter way. She felt seen. Not idealized. Not misunderstood. Seen as she was now. That recognition stirred something she had learned to keep dormant. Claire reached for her phone, then stopped. She wasn't sure what she wanted to say. The truth hovered close, but it felt too large to compress into a message. too important to risk flattening into convenience. She set the phone down and paced the room, then stopped, hands braced against the window. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall. Light, tentative. New York rain was different from Seattle's. Less patient. More abrupt. It arrived without lingering, as if it had somewhere else to be. She thought of Seattle anyway. She thought of the way Ethan had looked at her in the park. Not guarded. Not rehearsed. Present in a way she hadn't expected. That presence was the crack. The thing she hadn't planned for. She picked up her phone again, heart steady but resolve firm. "Can I ask you something?" The message sent before doubt could intervene. Ethan's phone buzzed on the bedside table. He opened his eyes. The message pulled him upright immediately. Of course. A response came faster than he intended. There was a pause. Then, "Why didn't you tell me you were scared?" The question landed without accusation. That was what made it devastating. Ethan stared at the screen, the city's reflection trembling across the glass. He read the message again, then a third time, as if searching for an easier interpretation. There wasn't one. He typed a response, deleted it. Typed again. The words felt too small for the truth they were meant to carry. I didn't know how. Too thin. I thought being strong meant handling it alone. Still not enough. Minutes passed. The rain outside intensified, streaking down the window in uneven paths. Claire waited, phone resting in her palm, pulse steady but alert. She hadn't asked the question to provoke guilt. She asked because she needed to know whether the silence had been choice or incapacity. Whether the distance had been intentional or simply human. Her phone buzzed. Because I didn't understand that fear wasn't something I had to solve before sharing. She read the message slowly. I thought admitting it would make me unreliable. Weak. And I didn't want to put that on you. Claire closed her eyes. The answer didn't erase the past, but it reframed it. You decided for me, she wrote. That's what hurt the most. Ethan swallowed hard. I know. There it was. No defense. No explanation layered over the acknowledgement. Just ownership. The silence that followed felt heavier, but not hostile. Claire sat down on the edge of the bed, the city noise fading into the background. I didn't need you to be certain, she wrote finally. I needed you to be honest. Ethan leaned forward. Elbows on his knees, phone glowing between his hands. I'm trying to learn the difference now. The rain continued to fall, steady and unapologetic. Something inside Ethan shifted. Not relief, not absolution, but recognition. The crack Claire had opened wasn't a break. It was an entry point. Across the city, Claire felt it too. The truth hadn't arrived all at once. It had seeped in through the smallest opening, demanding attention not through force, but through clarity. Neither of them knew what would come next. But they both knew the silence they had built their lives around could no longer hold. The crack was there now. And through it, something honest had begun to surface. Ethan did not sleep much that night. Not because of noise. The city outside eventually softened into a distant hum. But because his mind refused to retreat into the carefully controlled quiet he had relied on for years. The conversation with Claire replayed itself in fragments, each one peeling back another layer of the reasoning he had built his life around. Why didn't you tell me you were scared? The question had not accused him. That was what made it unbearable. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, watching shadows shift as headlights passed somewhere below. His phone rested on the bedside table, screen dark now, but the weight of the words remained. For years, Ethan had believed he understood why he left. Career opportunity, timing, logistics, responsibility. All of it had sounded so convincing when repeated often enough. Now, stripped of distance and denial, the explanation felt incomplete, like a story told from the outside instead of the inside. Sometime before dawn, he gave up on sleep. He showered, dressed, and left the hotel while the sky was still undecided about morning. The streets were quieter then, the city briefly suspended between what it had been the night before and what it would demand once fully awake. Ethan walked until the movement slowed his thoughts. Claire's words followed him anyway. "I didn't need you to be certain. I needed you to be honest." He had been honest, he told himself. Just not in the way she meant. Honest about circumstances. Honest about options. Honest about everything except the thing that mattered most. Fear. By the time the conference sessions began, Ethan had already decided something important. If he was going to keep talking to Claire, if he was going to stay in this space where the past no longer remained politely buried, then he had to confront the truth without abstraction. Not for her, for himself. That afternoon, between sessions, he found an empty corner of the convention center and sat down, phone in hand. The city outside buzzed with midday urgency, but inside his chest, everything felt slow and deliberate. He opened the message thread. "You asked me why I didn't tell you I was scared," he typed. He paused. This time he didn't delete. "I think I finally understand the real answer." The message sent before he could retreat. Claire received it in Boston hours later, during a break between meetings. She sat alone at a small table, notebook closed, coffee untouched. The rain outside had returned light, but persistent, tapping against the window with familiar insistence. She read Ethan's message once, then again. Her response came carefully. "I'm listening." Back in New York, Ethan exhaled slowly. "When I got the Houston offer," he wrote, "I told myself it was about timing. About careers moving at different speeds. But that wasn't the part that scared me." But the memory sharpened as he typed, pulling him backward with unexpected force. Houston rose in his mind fully formed. The heat, the brightness, the sense that everything there demanded momentum. He remembered the apartment he'd stayed in during those first weeks. Temporary, sparse, unforgivingly quiet at night. He remembered how often he'd reached for his phone, then set it down again. What scared me," he continued, "was realizing how much I needed you." The words felt dangerous even now. Not emotionally in the abstract. Practically, daily. In ways I didn't know how to articulate, without feeling like I was handing you responsibility for my stability. Claire's breath caught slightly as she read. She stayed still, letting the meaning settle, instead of rushing to interpret. "I'd spent my whole life believing independence was the same thing as strength," Ethan wrote. "That needing someone meant I'd failed to manage myself properly. With you, that belief fell apart." In Houston, years earlier, he had sat alone on his couch, city lights glaring through the window, and felt something close to panic settle in his chest. Not because he missed her. Because he couldn't pretend he didn't rely on her presence to feel grounded. He'd been afraid of that truth. Afraid that if he stayed, he would ask too much. Afraid that if he failed, she would pay the price. So he had chosen control instead. Leaving felt like the only way to avoid becoming someone I didn't know how to be, he typed. Someone who needed help. Claire stared at the screen, the noise of the cafe fading completely. She had imagined many explanations over the years, This was not one of them. You thought needing me would make you less capable, she wrote slowly. Yes, Ethan replied. And I didn't trust myself enough to let that be okay. The honesty in the exchange felt almost unbearable in its clarity. For the first time, Claire understood that his silence hadn't been rooted in indifference or convenience. It had been rooted in fear of vulnerability, so deep it disguised itself as responsibility. She closed her eyes briefly. I never needed you to be invincible, she wrote. I needed you to be real. Ethan read the words with something like grief tightening his chest. I know, he replied. And that's the part I regret most. I made a decision about who I thought I had to be, instead of trusting who I already was with you. The rain in Boston intensified, streaking the glass with urgency. Claire felt something shift. Not absolution, not forgiveness, but understanding. Understanding did not erase pain, but it changed its shape. Thank you for telling me this, she wrote after a long pause. Sira, I wish you'd trusted me with it then. But I'm glad you're trusting me with it now. And Ethan leaned back against the wall, phone lowering slightly as the words settled. He realized then that this was what he had avoided all those years. Not the conversation itself, but the risk of being known without armor. Houston had demanded certainty. Claire had invited honesty. He had chosen the wrong currency. Outside, New York moved relentlessly forward, unaware of the reckoning unfolding within a quiet corner of its sprawl. Inside Ethan, something loosened. Not because the past had been repaired, but because it had finally been named. Why he left was no longer a story he told himself to stay comfortable. It was a truth he could now carry without hiding. And that truth, spoken at last, changed the space between him and Claire in ways silence never could. Claire did not respond right away. Not because she didn't know what to say, but because she finally understood what she needed to ask. The rain in Boston had settled into a steady rhythm by the time she left work that evening. Not dramatic, not heavy, just persistent enough to demand acknowledgement. She walked without an umbrella, letting the drizzle collect in her hair and coat, the coolness grounding her as her thoughts arranged themselves into something she could no longer postpone. Understanding Ethan's fear had softened something sharp inside her. But it had not erased the question that had lived quietly with her for years. She walked along the river, shoes tapping against wet pavement, the city glowing faintly through mist. Boats sat idle in the water, tethered and unmoving, as if waiting for permission to drift again. That was how she felt now. Claire stopped beneath a street lamp and pulled out her phone. Ethan's last message was still there, unadorned by follow-ups. He had told her the truth. Fully. Without defense. Now it was her turn. Can I ask you something that might be hard? She typed. The message, sent before hesitation, could reclaim control. In Seattle, Ethan was standing in his kitchen, staring at nothing in particular, when the phone vibrated against the counter. He read the message once, then nodded to himself. Yes, he replied. Ask. Claire inhaled slowly. This was the question she had avoided because it felt dangerous. Not because it would hurt him, but because it would force her to confront the most vulnerable part of her own experience. Did you ever miss me? She wrote. Or did the silence make it easier to forget? She pressed send, and immediately felt the weight of it settle into her chest. There it was. Not accusation. Not bitterness. Just truth, finally spoken. Ethan felt the question land with full force. He leaned both hands against the counter, head bowed, the city outside his window blurred by rain. The answer rose instantly, sharp and undeniable. But he knew instinctively that honesty here required more than reassurance. It required detail, presence, time. He picked up the phone. "I missed you constantly," he typed. Then stopped. Deleted it. Not because it wasn't true, but because it wasn't enough. "I missed you in ways I didn't have language for," he continued. "For not just emotionally. Practically." Daily he paced the apartment as he typed. Memory unfurling without restraint now. "I missed how you noticed things before I did. How conversations felt easier when you were in the room. Even when they were hard. The silence didn't make it easier," he wrote. "It made it quieter. That's not the same thing." Claire read the words as she resumed walking, rain tracing paths down her sleeves. Her chest tightened. Not painfully, but with recognition. "I told myself you were fine without me," she wrote. "That was how I survived it." Ethan read that line slowly. "I wasn't fine," he replied. "I was functional. There's a difference." The honesty stripped away the last layer of distance between them. Claire stopped walking. Cars passed behind her, water spraying against curbs, the city continuing without pause. She stood still in it, phone warm in her hand, heart steady, but exposed. "Why didn't you come back?" she asked. There it was, the question beneath all other questions. Ethan closed his eyes. The answer wasn't flattering. It wasn't noble. It was human. Because I was afraid that if I did," he wrote, "you'd see how much the silence had changed me. And decide I wasn't worth reopening the wound." Claire's breath caught slightly. "I convinced myself leaving you alone was kinder than asking you to take that risk," he continued. "I didn't realize that not giving you the choice was its own kind of harm." The rain seemed to grow louder around her. "You took away my ability to grieve honestly," she wrote after a long pause, "because I never knew if the story was finished." Then sat down heavily, the weight of her words settling fully now. "I'm sorry," he replied. "Not in the abstract. Specifically. For that." Claire closed her eyes, letting the apology land where it belonged. This wasn't closure. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was truth spoken without distortion. "Thank you for answering," she wrote. "I needed to hear it. Even though it hurts." Sir Ethan leaned back, staring at the ceiling, rain tapping against the glass like punctuation. "I know," he replied. "And I don't expect this to fix anything. I just didn't want the silence to keep lying for me." Claire felt something shift. Not relief. Not release. But clarity. The question that had haunted her since Houston no longer echoed unanswered in the quiet corners of her mind. The truth, painful as it was, and weight could be set down. She resumed walking. The city unfolding ahead of her, rain cooling her skin, breath steady. For the first time in years, the question that hurt no longer controlled her. It had been asked. It had been answered. And whatever came next would no longer be shaped by what remained unspoken. Claire slept after that conversation, but not deeply. The night moved in fragments. Half, dreams stitched together by the sound of rain against the window and the memory of words that had finally been given shape. When morning arrived, it did not feel like an ending or a beginning. It felt like a clearing, a space where something long held could finally be examined without flinching. She woke early before the city decided what kind of day it wanted to be. Boston was gray again, the sky low and undecided. The street outside her apartment glistened, the rain having left behind a thin reflective sheen that made everything look slightly unreal. Claire made coffee and stood by the window, mug warming her hands, letting the quiet settle. Ethan had answered her question. Fully. Carefully. Without escape routes. That mattered more than she had expected. But understanding his fear did not erase her own experience. It didn't undo the years she had learned to live with a particular absence. It didn't rewrite the small adjustments she had made to survive something that never received a proper name. This morning, she realized she needed to say her part. Not as rebuttal, not as accusation, but as truth. Not because Ethan owed her absolution. Because she owed herself honesty. She picked up her phone, opened their thread, and stared at the blank message field. The cursor blinked, patient and indifferent, as if reminding her that silence was still an option. She let out a slow breath. "There's something I need to tell you," she typed. She paused, reread the words, then continued. "Nos, not to argue with what you shared. Just to add what it was like on my side." The message sent. Her heart beat steadily, not fast, not hesitant. This wasn't fear. It was resolve. In Seattle. Ethan read the message while standing at his kitchen counter, the city beyond his window softened by mist. He felt the shift immediately, the sense that whatever came next would not be abstract or gentle. "Okay," he replied. "I'm here." Claire sat down at her small kitchen table, coffee forgotten, rain-muted light pooling across the wood. She did not rush. She allowed the words to come at the pace they required. "When you left," she began, "I didn't think you were wrong." That truth surprised even her. "I thought you were doing what you believed was responsible. And I respected that." "I still do." She paused, fingers resting lightly against the screen. "But respect didn't protect me from the way the silence changed things." Ethan read slowly, absorbing each line without interruption. "At first," Claire continued, "why told myself I could handle it. That distance was temporary, that you just needed time." She remembered those early weeks vividly now. The way she had measured days by response times. The way hope had disguised itself as patience. When the messages stopped, she wrote, "I didn't feel abandoned right away. I felt erased. Like the part of my life that included you had simply been closed without explanation." Ethan sat down heavily, phone still in his hand. "I didn't know how to grieve something that hadn't been clearly ended," Claire wrote. There was no final moment to react to. Just absence. And absence makes you question your own reality. She paused again, choosing her words with care. "I wondered if I had imagined how close we were. If I had misread what we meant to each other." That line landed with particular force. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. "I learned how to become very good at not needing answers," Claire continued. "Not because I stopped wanting them, but because wanting them hurt too much." She thought about Palo Alto. About the way she had learned to be efficient with her emotions there. The way she had compressed longing into productivity. "Silence taught me to expect less from people," she wrote. "Including myself." The honesty of that admission felt like setting something down she had carried too long. Ethan stared at the words, a familiar tightness forming in his chest. Not defensiveness, not panic, but recognition. "I stopped asking questions," Claire went on. "I stopped assuming people would stay when things got uncomfortable. I told myself that independence meant not needing reassurance." Her phone rested lightly in her hands now, her breathing even. "That version of me survived," she wrote. But she was smaller. There was a long pause on both ends. Rain ticked softly against windows in two different cities. Finally, Ethan responded. "I didn't realize the silence would do that to you," he typed. I thought I was giving you space to heal. Claire nodded to herself, as if he could see the gesture. I know, she replied. That's why I'm telling you this without anger. Because the intent and the impact were different. She took another breath. I'm not sharing this so you'll feel guilty, she wrote. I'm sharing it because I need you to understand what it cost me. Not so we can undo it, but so it doesn't stay invisible. Ethan leaned forward, elbows on his knees, phone glowing between his hands. Thank you for trusting me with that, he replied. I'm listening. Please keep going if there's more. Claire considered the invitation. There was more. There was a point, she wrote slowly, where I stopped missing you, the way people usually describe missing someone. It wasn't longing anymore. It was adjustment. That distinction mattered. I learned how to build a life that didn't require your presence, she continued. And that wasn't bitterness. It was necessity. She remembered the first time she realized she hadn't thought about him all day, and the complicated relief that followed. By the time I moved to Boston, she wrote, I wasn't waiting for you, but I was still carrying the version of myself who never got to say what she needed. Ethan swallowed hard. That's why I reached out, Claire concluded. Not because I wanted to go back, but because I wanted to stop carrying that unfinished version of me forward. She set the phone down then, hands resting on the table, chest rising and falling steadily. The truth had been spoken. In Seattle, Ethan read the last message twice. Then he stood, walked to the window, and pressed his palm lightly against the glass. The city beyond felt distant, almost unreal. He typed carefully. So I hear you, he wrote. And Wand. I believe you. I don't think what you're saying negates what I felt, he continued. I think it completes it. Claire read the response with quiet attentiveness. I can't undo what the silence shaped, Ethan added. But I don't want it to remain the loudest thing between us. Claire closed her eyes. That was the difference now. Not promises, not rewrites. Presence. Thank you, she replied. War for letting me say it all the way through. They did not rush into what came next. They didn't need to. Her truth had been spoken, not as a weapon, not as a plea, but as a statement of self. Claire stood from the table and moved back to the window, watching the rain blur the city into softened edges. She felt lighter. Not because the past had been resolved, but because it had been acknowledged without distortion. For the first time since Houston, since Seattle, since the long stretch of silence that followed, she no longer felt like she was carrying a story alone. And that, quiet, grounded, unremarkable as it seemed, changed everything. Guilt did not arrive in Ethan Walker's life as a sudden collapse. It settled slowly, deliberately, like sediment sinking to the bottom of clear water once everything that had been stirred up was finally allowed to rest. Claire's words echoed through him long after he set his phone down, not sharp, not accusatory, but precise in a way that made escape impossible. Silence taught me to expect less from people. Like that sentence followed him through the day. Seattle was quiet that morning, the rain reduced to a fine mist that softened edges without fully obscuring them. Ethan took the long way to work, hands buried in his coat pockets, breath fogging faintly in the cold air. The city felt contemplative, as if it too were holding space for something unresolved. He replayed Claire's message. Not selectively, not defensively, but fully. He had known, in theory, that his silence caused pain. What he had never allowed himself to confront was the shape of that pain. The way it lingered. the way it altered how someone learned to move through the world. At the office, he sat at his desk and stared at the screen longer than usual before beginning. The familiar rhythm of tasks felt distant, almost irrelevant. Emails arrived, meetings started, voices filled the room, but everything felt slightly muted, as if he were hearing it all through a layer of glass. This was what reckoning felt like. Not drama, not collapse. Clarity without anesthesia. He thought about Houston again, not the job, not the opportunity, but the aftermath. The weeks where he had told himself he was doing the right thing, because doing the right thing was supposed to feel difficult. But difficulty alone wasn't evidence of correctness. He remembered sitting alone at night, convincing himself that Claire's resilience meant she didn't need him. That her calm acceptance had been proof of her strength, rather than the cost of loving someone who chose distance. That interpretation had been convenient. It had allowed him to live with himself. Now, stripped of convenience, the memory felt different. He hadn't just stepped away. He had withdrawn without explanation, leaving her to make sense of the silence alone. That realization pressed heavily against his chest. By the time Ethan returned home that evening, the sky had darkened fully. The rain returned in earnest, drumming against windows and pavement with steady insistence. He didn't turn on the lights right away. He stood in the entryway, listening to the familiar sounds of his apartment. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant rush of traffic. The quiet he had curated so carefully. This quiet no longer felt neutral. It felt complicit. Ethan moved to the window and looked out at the city, his reflection layered faintly over the lights below. He saw himself clearly then, not as the careful, responsible man he'd believed himself to be, but as someone who had prioritized control over courage. Guilt rose, not loud, not performative. Just true. He picked up his phone. This time, there was no hesitation. "I've been thinking about what you said all day," he typed. "About how the silence changed you." He stopped, then continued. "I didn't just walk away from a relationship. I walked away from the responsibility of being known." The words came easier now, not because they were painless, but because he no longer tried to soften them. "I told myself I was protecting you, but what I was really protecting was my sense of control." He leaned back against the counter, eyes closed briefly. "Sivis, I see now that my absence asked you to carry questions you shouldn't have had to answer alone." Claire read the message later that night, seated on her couch with a blanket pulled loosely around her shoulders. The rain in Boston mirrored Seattle's, steady, persistent, unwilling to be ignored. She read slowly. Carefully, Ethan continued. "I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not asking you to reframe what you went through. I just need you to know that I'm finally letting myself feel the full weight of what my silence did." She set the phone down for a moment, letting the sincerity of it settle before responding. "Guilt isn't useful unless it changes how we act," she wrote finally. Ethan nodded to himself as he read it. "I know," he replied. "That's why I'm telling you this. Not to punish myself, but to make sure I don't disappear again when things get uncomfortable." That was the heart of it. Claire considered the words. She had heard apologies before, polished, careful, designed to close conversations quickly. This didn't feel like that. This felt unfinished. Which, strangely, made it honest. "I don't need you to carry this forever," she wrote. "But I do need to know you're capable of staying present when it's hard." Ethan stared at the message for a long time. "I'm trying to learn how," he replied. Not perfectly. Just intentionally. Outside, the rain intensified, streaking the glass with urgency. Inside, something in Ethan loosened. Not relief, not absolution, but alignment. Guilt, when faced directly, no longer felt like a weight dragging him backward. It felt like an anchor. Something that held him in place when instinct urged retreat. For the first time in years, he didn't want to run from the discomfort. He wanted to stay with it long enough for it to mean something. He moved to the couch and sat down, phone resting beside him, the apartment no longer feeling like a sanctuary built from avoidance. It felt like a place where accountability could live. The rain continued to fall outside, steady and patient. And for the first time since Houston, since Seattle, since the long stretch of silence that had shaped him more than he'd realized, Ethan Walker understood something clearly. Guilt was not the enemy. Avoidance was. And this time, he was choosing differently. Ethan did not invite Claire to Seattle lightly. The idea surfaced gradually, not as a solution or a gesture meant to prove anything, but as a quiet acknowledgement of something both of them had already felt. Words, however honest, had reached their limit. Presence was next. The invitation itself was simple. "I'll be home for the next couple of weeks," he wrote one evening. "If you ever want to come out here. No pressure, no expectations. I'd like that." He didn't add qualifiers. He didn't over-explain. He let the message stand on its own. Claire read it in Boston, seated at her kitchen table long after sunset, the city outside wrapped in fog. She didn't answer right away. Not because she was unsure of what she felt, but because she wanted to be precise about what she was agreeing to. Seattle carried weight. It was where the silence began. It was where memory lived in physical form. Traveling there wasn't neutral. 2 days later, she replied, "I can come for a weekend. Just to walk. To talk. Nothing more than that." Ethan read the message with a steady calm that surprised him. "That's exactly what I had in mind," he answered. When Claire arrived, Seattle greeted her the way it always had, with rain that felt less like weather and more like atmosphere. The clouds hung low, the air cool and damp. The city softened into shades of gray that felt strangely intimate. Ethan met her at the airport. They didn't rush toward each other. They stood a few feet apart at first, assessing the moment, the way people do when they know this encounter carries more meaning than either of them has named. "Hi, Claire," he replied. This time, the hug came naturally. Not cautious. Not restrained. Brief, but grounding. The kind of embrace that acknowledged history without being consumed by it. Ethan drove them into the city with quiet focus, rain tapping against the windshield in an irregular rhythm. Claire watched the familiar streets pass by, noticing how memory layered itself over the present without overwhelming it. Seattle felt different now. Not lighter, just clearer. They didn't go to his apartment immediately. Instead, they parked near the waterfront, the city unfolding around them in muted tones. The rain had softened into a mist, barely noticeable unless you paid attention. "Do you want to walk?" Ethan asked. Claire nodded. They moved side by side along the path, footsteps steady, hands tucked into pockets. The water beside them reflected scattered lights, rippling gently as boats drifted in the distance. For a while, neither spoke. This silence was intentional. It held space rather than withholding it. Ethan felt the urge to fill it, old instinct rising, but resisted. He had learned, finally, that some moments asked not for explanation, but for endurance. Claire noticed the restraint. It mattered. After a few minutes, she spoke. I used to imagine this, she said quietly. Ethan turned his head slightly. Being here. Walking like this, she clarified. After everything. I just never thought it would actually happen. He nodded, eyes forward. Neither did I. They continued, rain settling lightly on their coats, the city's noise distant and unobtrusive. I thought if I came back, Claire said, choosing her words with care, it would feel heavier. And does it? Ethan asked. She considered the question honestly. Different kind of heavy. Less sharp. That felt accurate to him too. They reached a stretch of the path where the city opened up slightly. The skyline reflected faintly in the water. Ethan slowed, then stopped. Claire did the same. This is where I used to come when I didn't know what to do with myself, he said. She looked at him, surprised. After Houston. Less. The admission hung between them. I told myself I was thinking things through. He continued. Really, I was avoiding feeling them. Claire studied his face, rain catching in her hair. What did you feel here? He exhaled. Regret. Relief. Fear. Sometimes all at once. She nodded, absorbing the honesty without flinching. I came here once too, she said. Before I left Seattle for good. Ethan turned fully toward her. You never told me that? I didn't think it mattered, she replied. I sat on a bench not far from here and tried to decide whether staying quiet was strength or surrender. What did you decide? He asked. That it was survival, she said. At the time, the rain intensified slightly, droplets darkening the pavement, the air cool against their skin. They resumed walking, closer now, though neither acknowledged the shift. Ethan felt the weight of proximity. Not physical desire, not urgency, but awareness. Every step beside her felt intentional. Chosen. I don't want to do that again, he said quietly. Do what? Claire asked. Disappear when things get complicated. She slowed, then stopped, turning to face him fully. Then don't, she said. Not harsh. Not challenging. Simply direct. I'm trying to understand what staying looks like, he admitted. Without turning it into a promise I can't keep. Claire held his gaze, rain tracing a slow path down her cheek. Staying isn't about guarantees, she said. It's about presence. Even when it's uncomfortable. He nodded. I'm learning that. They stood there for a moment longer, the city breathing around them, rain steady but gentle. Claire broke the silence. There's something else I need you to know, she said. Ethan waited. Coming here doesn't mean I'm ready to rebuild what we had, she continued. It means I'm open to seeing who we are now. The distinction mattered. I understand, he said. And he did. They turned back toward the car as night deepened. The city lights growing warmer against the dark. When they reached the parking lot, Ethan unlocked the doors, but neither moved immediately. The rain slowed again, tapering into a soft drizzle. Thank you for inviting me, Claire said. Thank you for coming, he replied. They drove back to his apartment in quiet companionship. Inside, the space felt different with her there. Not transformed, but inhabited. Lived in. They didn't sit close. They didn't touch unnecessarily. They talked about small things. What they wanted for dinner. How tired travel made you. How Seattle always smelled like rain, even when it wasn't raining. Later, standing by the window, Claire watched the city blur into reflected light. This place feels less empty than I imagined, she said. Ethan followed her gaze. It used to feel emptier. She turned toward him then, something unspoken passing between them. The night had not resolved anything. It hadn't offered clarity or direction. But as the rain continued its patient fall outside, both of them understood something important. They were no longer hiding behind distance. They were standing in the same place, under the same sky, letting presence carry what words no longer could. And for now, that was enough. Morning arrived quietly in Seattle. The rain had paused sometime before dawn, leaving the city washed clean and reflective, as if it had been holding its breath overnight. Pale light filtered through the clouds, soft and tentative, settling into Ethan's apartment without demanding attention. Claire woke first. She lay still for a moment, listening to the distant hum of traffic, to the unfamiliar creaks of the building, to the sound of another person moving somewhere beyond the door. Ethan was already awake. She could sense it in the subtle rhythms of the space, the way the quiet felt inhabited rather than empty. This was the part she hadn't rehearsed. The morning after presence. She sat up slowly, feet touching the cool floor, grounding herself before memory could rush in and rewrite the moment. The apartment looked different in daylight. Less guarded, more human. There were signs of a life lived deliberately but cautiously. Books stacked neatly. A jacket draped over a chair. No photographs on the walls. Nothing here demanded permanence. That both comforted and unsettled her. In the kitchen, Ethan stood at the counter making coffee, movements unhurried. He looked up when she entered, a faint smile crossing his face. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she replied. They moved around each other carefully, instinctively aware of shared space without assuming it. No awkwardness, no false familiarity. Just attentiveness. They ate quietly, conversation light and sparse. Talk of travel fatigue. Of the weather holding, briefly. Of how Seattle mornings always felt like a question waiting to be answered. Eventually, Claire set her mug down and exhaled softly. "There's something I've been thinking about," she said. Ethan looked at her, attentive, unguarded. "Okay." She met his gaze steadily. "I don't want this visit to turn into a memory we romanticize." The honesty surprised him, but he nodded. "Neither do I. I needed to see you," she continued. "To know what standing in the same place again would feel like. But I also need to be honest about where I am." He waited. "I'm not afraid of losing you again," she said quietly. "I already survived that." The words were not cruel. They were simply true. Ethan absorbed them without flinching. "I know." "What I'm afraid of," she continued, "is rebuilding something that only works when we're careful." She stood then, moving to the window, looking out at the city, as if it might offer language she hadn't yet found. "I don't want love that requires constant restraint," she said. "I don't want to always wonder whether honesty will make you leave." The air between them tightened. Not with tension, but with consequence. Ethan stood as well, stopping a respectful distance away. "I don't want that either," he said. "And I don't want to pretend I already know how to be different." She turned to face him. "Then we might be standing at the edge of the same truth." He nodded slowly. They sat on opposite ends of the couch, the space between them deliberate again. "This could be the moment we decide to let go," Claire said. "Not because we don't care, but because caring doesn't automatically make something sustainable." Ethan stared at the floor, jaw tightening briefly before he looked back up. "I've thought about that," he admitted. about whether the most respectful thing I could do is step back again. Her breath caught slightly. And it terrifies me, he said. Not because I'd be alone, but because I know now that silence would no longer be honest. Claire studied him carefully. You're not wrong to be afraid, she said. But fear doesn't get to make the decision for us anymore. They sat with that. Outside, the city stirred. A car passed, tires whispering over damp pavement. Somewhere a siren sounded briefly, then faded. This visit, Claire said finally, might be enough on its own. Ethan met her eyes. And if it is, then we part without unfinished words, she said. That matters. He nodded. It does. The weight of almost letting go settled between them. Not heavy, but real. They spent the rest of the morning walking the city again, daylight revealing details the night had softened. They spoke more openly now, not avoiding the truth, but not forcing it either. At the airport, they stood near the gate, the inevitability of departure sharpening everything that remained unsaid. I'm glad we didn't rush, Claire said. So am I, Ethan replied. She hesitated, then stepped forward, resting her forehead briefly against his chest. The gesture was intimate without promise, grounding without implication. Whatever happens next, she said softly, I don't regret coming here. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Neither do I. They separated without drama. No declarations. No pleas. Just recognition. As Claire walked toward security, Ethan remained where he was, watching until she disappeared from view. The feeling in his chest wasn't panic. It was clarity. Almost letting go wasn't the same as giving up. Sometimes, it was the only way to ensure that whatever remained was chosen freely. Not out of fear, habit, or unfinished longing. Outside the airport, the rain returned lightly, barely noticeable. Seattle breathed, and Ethan Walker stood still long enough to decide whether he was ready to stay present. No matter which direction the choice required. The choice did not arrive with clarity. It arrived with quiet persistence, the kind that followed Ethan Walker through the days after Claire left Seattle, settling into the corners of his routines and refusing to be ignored. He returned to work, to meetings and deadlines and the familiar structure that once made everything feel manageable. On the surface, nothing had changed. Internally, everything had. The apartment felt different without her presence. Not emptier, but louder. The silence he had cultivated for years now echoed with context. Every pause seemed to ask a question he could no longer defer. He found himself replaying the morning they'd shared, not for nostalgia, but for accuracy. Claire's words had been careful, measured, and unmistakably honest. I don't want love that requires constant restraint. That sentence followed him like a marker on a map. Ethan understood, now that restraint had once been his currency. It had allowed him to appear composed while quietly withdrawing from discomfort. He had believed that staying controlled meant staying safe. Claire had asked for something else. Presence. And presence, he was learning, was not passive. It demanded decision. In the days that followed, their messages slowed. Not out of avoidance, but respect. They didn't fill the space with reassurance or logistics. They let the visit settle without rushing to define it. That restraint was new too. Ethan spent evenings walking the city, rain returning in brief spells that softened the streets and sharpened his thoughts. He passed places he'd avoided before. Cafes they used to frequent, corners where memory waited patiently. Instead of turning away, he stopped. He sat. He stayed. The discomfort did not diminish, but it clarified. One evening, as dusk settled and the city lights began to glow, Ethan found himself standing near the waterfront again, the place where he had once avoided feeling too much. The water moved steadily beside him, indifferent to hesitation. He took out his phone. Not to distract himself. To decide. Across the country, Claire Bennett was in New York for work, the city greeting her with its usual unapologetic urgency. She moved through meetings with practiced focus, but part of her attention remained elsewhere. Alert. Watchful. Aware that something unresolved hovered just beyond reach. She didn't feel anxious. She felt prepared. Prepared for either outcome. That, she knew, was the difference. Her phone buzzed just as she stepped out of a building into the evening air. Ethan's name lit the screen. She stopped walking. "I've been thinking about what you said," his message read. About restraint. About honesty. She waited. "I don't want to build something that only works when I'm careful," he continued. "And I don't want to disappear again when fear shows up." Claire's breath steadied. "I don't know yet what the future looks like," he wrote. "But I do know I don't want to let the possibility of us be decided by avoidance." The words were deliberate. Not dramatic. Not pleading, chosen. Claire read them twice before responding. "What does that mean to you?" she asked. In Seattle, Ethan watched the rain begin again, droplets catching the city lights in brief flashes before dissolving into the dark. "It means staying present even when there's no guarantee," he thought. "It means choosing courage without certainty." He typed. "It means I'm willing to be here, consistently, transparently, not as a promise of outcome, but as a commitment to showing up." There was a pause. Claire leaned against a building, the city flowing around her in sound and motion. She closed her eyes briefly, not to avoid the weight of the moment, but to meet it fully. "I need to say this clearly," she wrote. "I'm not asking you to make up for the past. I'm asking you to meet me in the present." There Ethan nodded to himself. "That's what I'm choosing," he replied. The word settled between them. Choosing. Not chasing. Not clinging. Not rescuing. Choosing. Claire inhaled slowly. "Then I need to choose to," she wrote. "And I won't do that unless I believe you'll stay when it's uncomfortable." Ethan didn't hesitate. "I will. Not perfectly. But intentionally." She let the words sit. The city noise receded, leaving her with the quiet awareness that this was the moment she had prepared herself for. Not to be persuaded, but to decide. "Okay," she wrote finally. "Then let's try this without rewriting it into something safer than it is." Ethan felt something loosen in his chest. Not relief, not triumph, but alignment. "Agreed," he replied. No disguises. If they didn't define terms that night, they didn't outline expectations or timelines. They didn't promise permanence or predict success. They chose presence. In the days that followed, the choice revealed itself in small, tangible ways. Ethan didn't retreat into silence when doubt surfaced. He named it. Claire didn't soften her needs to maintain harmony. She voiced them. They scheduled time intentionally, not constantly, not reactively, but with awareness. They let conversations breathe without letting them disappear. In New York, Claire noticed how different this felt from before. Not because the past was erased, but because it was no longer steering. She wasn't waiting to be chosen. She was choosing to. One evening, weeks later, Ethan stood in his apartment, suitcase open on the bed. New York lights flickered faintly on his phone screen as he checked flight details. Claire would meet him there. Not as a culmination, As a continuation, the rain had stopped in Seattle, leaving the city quiet and reflective. Ethan zipped the suitcase closed and stood still for a moment, hand resting on the handle. This was the part that once would have triggered retreat. Movement, commitment, uncertainty. This time, he stepped forward. Across the country, Claire stood by her hotel window in New York, watching the city stretch endlessly in every direction. She felt steady, not because the future was clear, but because the choice had been made consciously, without illusion. The space between them no longer belonged to silence. It belonged to intention. And that, they both understood, was the only foundation worth standing on. Trust did not arrive with their decision. It did not descend fully formed, because words had finally been spoken, or because intentions had been named out loud. Trust, Claire quickly realized, was not a reward for courage. It was a process. Slow, uneven, and unwilling to be rushed. New York greeted Ethan with movement and noise, the city unfolding around him with unapologetic momentum. Claire met him outside the hotel where she was staying, the sidewalk crowded, the air sharp with early autumn chill. There was no dramatic reunion. Just recognition. They hugged briefly, comfortably, as people who had already crossed the threshold of uncertainty and now stood inside something quieter and more demanding. "How was the flight?" she asked. "Uneventful," he replied. "Which feels appropriate." She smiled faintly. "It does." They walked together, not touching, not distant, simply aligned. The city swallowed them quickly, the anonymity of crowds offering a strange kind of safety. For the first time since they had chosen to try again, Claire felt the edges of caution press in. Not fear. Awareness. She noticed how her body remained alert, even in moments that felt easy. How part of her waited, not for Ethan to fail, but for the familiar instinct to protect herself to surface. She didn't resent that instinct anymore. She respected it. Ethan noticed it too, though he framed it differently. He felt the effort required to stay present when nothing was explicitly wrong. The temptation to interpret calm as confirmation, to relax into assumption. He resisted it. Staying meant staying attentive. Not just when things were difficult, but when they were deceptively comfortable. They spent the afternoon walking the city, talking in measured rhythms. They didn't avoid depth, but they didn't force it either. Conversation moved organically, sometimes light, sometimes precise. Claire pointed out a bookstore she loved. Ethan listened as she explained why it mattered to her now, noticing how she spoke without editing herself for his comfort. He admired that. Later, sitting across from each other in a quiet restaurant, Claire set her fork down and met his gaze. "I need to say something," she said. Ethan nodded immediately. "Okay." Her voice remained calm, but her words carried intention. "I don't trust you yet," she said. "Not fully." The admission landed between them without hostility. Ethan did not flinch. "Thank you for telling me," he replied. She continued. "That doesn't mean I think you're lying. It means my body hasn't caught up to my understanding yet." He nodded. "That makes sense." She studied his reaction closely, searching for defensiveness, disappointment, pressure. Finding none, she exhaled slightly. "I don't need you to convince me," she added. "I need consistency. Over time." "I can do that," Ethan said. Not eagerly, not performatively. Simply. "I know," she replied. "And I need you to know that I'm paying attention." The honesty felt grounding rather than destabilizing. They finished dinner in companionable quiet, the city outside humming with life. When they stood to leave, Ethan hesitated briefly, then spoke. "Can I ask something too?" "Of course," Claire said. "What does staying look like for you?" he asked. When doubt shows up. She considered the question seriously. "It looks like not pretending I'm fine when I'm not," she said. "It looks like speaking before withdrawal becomes habit." Ethan nodded. "Then I'll do the same." They returned to the hotel together, the elevator ride quiet but not tense. At her door, they stopped. "This doesn't have to be complicated," Claire said. "No," Ethan agreed. "But it will be intentional." She smiled at that. "Good night, Ethan." "Good night, Claire." He watched her door close, then turned away without hesitation. This wasn't retreat. It was respect. Later, alone in his room, Ethan sat by the window, city lights reflecting against the glass. He felt the familiar urge to interpret progress as completion. He let it pass. Trust wasn't something he earned in a single act. It was something he demonstrated by staying, especially when reassurance wasn't immediate. Across the hallway, Claire lay in bed staring at the ceiling, phone resting beside her. She felt calm. Not because the past had loosened its grip entirely, but because, for the first time, she wasn't carrying the responsibility of belief alone. Trust would come, or it wouldn't. Either way, it would arrive honestly. And that, she knew, was the only kind worth waiting for. Staying did not look the way Ethan once imagined it would. There were no grand gestures, no sweeping declarations meant to overwrite uncertainty. There was no urgency to define what they were becoming. Instead, staying revealed itself in a series of deliberate, almost unremarkable choices, each one small enough to be overlooked, but meaningful enough to accumulate. Ethan stayed by showing up when there was nothing to fix. That was the hardest part. New York moved quickly around them, days dissolving into one another as Claire and Ethan settled into a shared rhythm that resisted dramatization. Mornings were independent. Evenings sometimes overlapped. They did not assume availability. They asked. Claire noticed that first. He didn't fill space when silence appeared. He didn't mistake quiet for distance. When conversation slowed, he didn't rush to reassure himself that things were fine. He waited. And, when doubt surfaced, he named it without asking her to dissolve it for him. One afternoon, as they walked through the city, Claire stopped at a crosswalk. The light red, traffic rushing past in sharp bursts. She turned to him suddenly. "Can I tell you something without you trying to solve it?" she asked. Ethan nodded immediately. "Yes." "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop," she said. "Not because of anything you're doing now, but because my body remembers what silence felt like." Ethan didn't interrupt. He didn't defend himself. He let the words land fully. "That makes sense," he said. "And I'm here, even when it feels like I might disappear." She studied his face, looking for the familiar flicker of retreat. It wasn't there. They crossed the street when the light changed, her steps steadier than before. Staying looked like Ethan texting when he said he would. Not obsessively, not performatively, but reliably. It looked like him acknowledging when work pulled his attention away instead of vanishing into it. It looked like him asking questions he didn't already know the answers to. Claire stayed too. She resisted the instinct to preemptively detach. She spoke when something unsettled her. Instead of filing it away for later, she allowed herself to enjoy moments without immediately bracing for their end. This was not forgiveness. It was participation. One evening, they sat in a quiet bar, the kind that absorbed conversation into soft music and low light. Rain traced slow paths down the windows, turning the city into abstraction. Claire rested her elbow on the table, chin propped lightly in her hand. "I used to think staying meant promising I wouldn't leave," she said. "And now?" Ethan asked. "Now I think it means choosing not to leave in this moment," she replied. Again and again. He nodded. "That feels more honest." Later, as they walked back through the city, Ethan slowed his pace unconsciously, matching hers. He noticed the habit forming, not obligation, not fear, but attunement. At her hotel, they stopped as they had before. "This is where I used to wonder if you'd disappear again," Claire said quietly. Ethan met her gaze. "And now?" "Now I'm watching what you do instead of what I imagine." He smiled faintly. "That's fair." He didn't linger longer than necessary. He didn't push closeness where space was needed. He stayed by leaving when it was right. In his room, Ethan lay awake later than usual, not restless but alert. Staying required attention even when reassurance wasn't immediate. Especially then. Across the hall, Claire slept deeply, her body slowly recalibrating to a present that did not demand constant vigilance. The city outside pulsed with life, indifferent and enduring. Between them, something steady took shape, not fragile, not guaranteed, but real. They were staying anyway. Not because the past had been redeemed. Not because the future was promised. But because, in this moment, presence felt more truthful than retreat. And for the first time, that was enough. The rain arrived without urgency. It didn't fall in sheets or announce itself with thunder. It drifted down lightly, intermittently, as if undecided about whether it wanted to commit to the evening. The city responded the way it always did. Lights reflecting off wet pavement, umbrellas opening and closing, people adjusting without complaint. Ethan noticed it first. They were walking along a quieter street, one of the few places in New York where the city softened its voice. The air smelled clean, washed through with that faint metallic scent rain always carried. He slowed, not intentionally. Just enough for Claire to notice. She followed his gaze upward. "It's barely raining," she said. "Yeah," he replied. "But it's there." They stopped beneath the awning of a closed storefront, not because they needed shelter, but because the pause felt natural. The street around them continued to move. Cars passing, footsteps echoing. But for a moment, they occupied a pocket of stillness carved out by nothing more than awareness. This was the space they had lived in for years, without knowing how to name it. Between messages never sent. Between words held back. Between decisions delayed long enough to become habits. Claire rested her back lightly against the glass, watching the rain trace thin lines down the surface. The droplets slid past one another, sometimes colliding, sometimes diverging, always moving downward in quiet persistence. "I used to think love was about timing," she said softly. "About finding the right moment and holding on to it." Ethan nodded, hands in his pockets, posture relaxed but attentive. "And now?" he asked. "And now I think it's about what we do in the pauses," she said. "The moments when nothing forces us to act, but we choose to anyway." The words settled between them, not heavy, not fragile. Just true. Ethan watched a drop of rain slide down the awning's edge, fall, disappear into the street below. "I think I lived most of my life between those moments," he said. "Waiting for certainty. Waiting for fear to pass." "And it never really did," Claire said. "No," he agreed. But neither did the feeling that I was avoiding something important. She turned her head to look at him fully then. The city lights caught the edges of her face, softening her expression without hiding its clarity. "This," she said, gesturing subtly to the street, the rain, the quiet they shared, "is what I didn't know how to ask for before." Ethan met her gaze. "What?" "Presence without performance," she replied. "Staying without promising." The rain eased further, thinning into something barely perceptible. They stood there, neither reaching for the other, neither retreating. The closeness between them wasn't defined by touch, it was defined by attention. Claire felt it settle into her body, not excitement, not anxiety, but recognition. She wasn't bracing, she wasn't waiting. She was here. Ethan felt it too, the quiet realization that this moment didn't require resolution to be meaningful. It didn't need a declaration or a plan. It existed fully on its own. "I don't know where this leads," he said quietly. Claire smiled. Not sadly. Not wistfully. "Neither do I," she replied. "But I know where we are." The rain stopped almost entirely then, the street drying unevenly, reflections breaking apart as the pavement reclaimed its texture. People emerged from under awnings. Umbrellas closed, the city resuming its familiar rhythm. Ethan stepped away from the storefront first, the pause complete. Claire fell into step beside him. They walked on side by side, the space between them easy now, unremarkable in the best possible way. Between raindrops, Ethan thought, was where everything important had been waiting all along. Not in the storms. Not in the declarations. But in the quiet spaces where choice replaced avoidance, and presence replaced fear. Claire glanced at him as they crossed the street, the light changing above them. "This feels different," she said. "It is," he replied. "Because we are." They continued walking. The city opening ahead of them, the rain leaving behind nothing but clean air and softened edges. There was no guarantee carried in their steps. But there was intention. And for both of them, that felt like enough. The city did not offer them an ending. New York never did. It offered continuation. Streets that led into other streets. Nights that softened into mornings, movement that carried forward whether or not anyone was ready for it. Claire and Ethan moved within that rhythm now, no longer bracing against it, no longer trying to control where it might take them. Their days settled into something unremarkable in the best way. They did not merge lives overnight. They did not rush to fill calendars or rewrite routines. Instead, they allowed proximity to exist without urgency, letting consistency reveal itself slowly, honestly. Claire noticed the change first in herself. She woke one morning in her hotel room, sunlight filtering through the curtains, and realized she wasn't rehearsing conversations in her head anymore. She wasn't scanning for signs of retreat or preemptively adjusting her expectations. She simply existed. That felt new. Ethan noticed it in the absence of the old reflex. To retreat when things felt undefined. When uncertainty surfaced, he didn't interpret it as danger. He stayed with it, letting discomfort pass through rather than dictate his next move. They met for breakfast on a quiet weekday morning, the city still stretching awake. The cafe was small, tucked between larger buildings, its windows fogged slightly from warmth meeting cold air. Claire stirred her coffee slowly, watching the motion settle before meeting his eyes. "This feels grounded," she said. Ethan nodded. "It does." She smiled faintly. "I used to think grounded meant boring." "And now?" he asked, And now I think it means safe enough to be honest, she replied. They sat with that, neither rushing to add more. Later, walking through the city, they passed a bookstore Claire loved. She paused, glancing inside. Do you want to go in? Ethan asked. Only if you don't mind wandering without a plan, she said. He smiled. I think I'm learning how. Inside, they drifted through shelves without commentary, occasionally holding up a book for the other to see. No pressure to impress. No need to explain why something mattered. Presence, again. That evening, they stood by the river, the city lights stretching across the water in long, broken lines. The air was cool, the sky clear, rain absent for once. I don't know what this becomes, Claire said, not as a warning, but as an observation. Ethan leaned against the railing beside her. Neither do I. She turned toward him. But I know what it isn't. He waited. It isn't unfinished, she said. And it isn't silent. He nodded, understanding the weight of that distinction. They did not define a future that night. They did not promise timelines or certainty. They acknowledged distance still existed. That lives built apart did not collapse into alignment simply because two people chose differently now. What they did was quieter and more difficult. They agreed to continue choosing presence. To speak before silence could calcify. To notice when fear tried to disguise itself as reason. To stay curious rather than defensive. On Claire's last night in New York, they walked once more through streets that had become familiar in a short span of time. The city hummed around them, steady and indifferent. At her hotel entrance, they stopped. This feels like a pause, Claire said. Not an ending. Ethan nodded. I think that's right. She studied his face, not searching for reassurance, just taking him in as he was now. I don't regret how this ended, she said softly. He met her gaze. Neither do I. They hugged. Longer this time, still unforced, still grounded. When they pulled apart, there was no rush to soften the moment with words. Some moments didn't require commentary. They parted with ease, not because attachment was absent, but because trust, still forming, still imperfect, no longer demanded constant proof. Later, alone, Ethan stood by his window and watched the city settle into night. He thought about Seattle, about rain, about the years he had lived between decisions instead of inside them. He thought about Claire, not as a symbol of what he'd lost, but as a person choosing him now, deliberately, without illusion. Across the city, Claire packed her bags slowly, unhurried. She felt calm, not because the future was clear, but because the past no longer dictated her posture within it. She had asked the questions. She had spoken the truth. She had stepped out of silence. That mattered. When morning came, the city moved on as it always did. Flights departed. Streets filled. Lives continued. Between raindrops, between moments, between what had been and what might be, two people carried forward something honest. Not a perfect love, not a promised one, but a chosen one. And for both of them, that was enough. Some stories don't end with certainty. They end with choice. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever lived between words you never sent, between moments you were afraid to choose, then you already know why this story exists. Like this video to support stories that honor quiet love. Subscribe to Between Raindrops Stories for emotionally grounded narratives that stay with you long after the rain stops. Comment below and tell us, have you ever chosen silence, or did you choose to speak? And if there's someone in your life who still lives between unsent messages, share this story with them. Because some love stories don't ask for grand gestures. They ask for presence, for courage, for honesty,